character, collaboration, and the art of dressing for the screen. The art of dressing for the screen is certainly true, but as well as being artists, all of our panelists are also scientists and psychologists and collaborators, and they're people who are multifaceted, and I'm sure you're going to see that as they talk. And the other interesting thing about them is the extraordinary diversity that brings people to work as costume designers, and as they speak, some of them will touch on some of the diversity of their career. And it's the diversity that I also wanted to mention before I introduce them, because there's something extraordinary about the diversity of the designers who work within the Australian costume scene. They're not, and they cannot afford to be specialists. You know, somebody is not just the sci-fi person or the period person. And as you'll see from the CVs of these designers, they have the ability to turn their hand from sheer fantasy to everyday contemporary clothing to period clothing, and it's the diversity of their portfolios that makes them such interesting designers. So first of all, what's going to happen is that each of them will speak for about 20 minutes on their particular area of interest, and then after each of them have spoken, we'll be open to questions. If you do have a question at the end of their individual talks, we are open to that, but hopefully we're going to keep a lot of the questions to the end, and then you'll have a lot of opportunity to ask your individual questions of them. So first of all, Cappi Ireland is going to speak, and I was actually saying to Cappi beforehand, when you look at her portfolio, extraordinary film and television, to name just a few: Home Song Stories, Balibo. She's fairly recently finished I, Frankenstein, which we haven't yet seen in the cinemas, but I'm really looking forward to, because that sounds extraordinarily interesting. The Rover, which also hasn't come out yet, and you're currently working on The Mule, which is another film that we anticipate. And mentioning Home Song Stories, I said to Cappi earlier, there's obviously a lot of camaraderie amongst the costume community, and obviously also a little bit of jealousy as well. And when I heard that she was going to be designing Home Song Stories, I was extremely jealous, and I thought, I wanted to do that. I would have loved to have done that. And then I went and saw it, and I realized she was absolutely the perfect person for it. And I was jealous of her work, not that she got the job, but she did it so beautifully. So I'm really pleased that she's going to be talking a little bit about that as well. And in her talk as well, she's going to concentrate on the research and the concept, the development of concept, which is an important part of the costume design process. Then Edie Kurzer, our next speaker, who I'll introduce before she speaks, is going to talk particularly about building character, the fact that it is definitely not fashion that we're talking about today, and I'm sure that when Deborah Nadulman-Lander speaks to you later on, she'll emphasize that as well. We're talking about building believable characters. Occasionally some of them wear fashionable clothes, but that is not what we're about. So Edie is going to talk particularly about in that area. And then Anna Borghesi is going to speak particularly about working with a director and the production designer, the actual process of design, and also that dreaded word budget, which is very much part of the reality of everything that one does in film and television production and general work for the screen. So I'd like to hand over to Cappi to talk about her work and particularly about the area of research and concept.
Hello, how are you going? Thank you. It was a lovely introduction. I'm going to talk about concept and research in film when you start when you come on board as a costume designer for a film, and I will show you a couple of clips from 2 films and some photo research and images that I collected on those films, so you can sort of see the whole package. So basically, once you start a film, you usually would have read the script before you got the job, but the process sort of starts with reading the script, having consultation with the director, production designer and the DOP, and then every job is very different in terms of how you approach it, in terms of the research and where, what you're looking at, because obviously different periods, different settings, different demographics, like no job is alike, basically. And then if you're doing a bigger American film, then you have a whole other kettle of fish to deal with in terms of producers on American films tend to have a lot more impact into the costume designs, I've discovered. And they're looking at the bigger picture, like franchises and the sequel and how they're going to market the film. So anyway, so basically, once you've sort of worked out, the genre and you know what period you're dealing with, you start researching, and that can be done in so many different ways. Obviously, now we've got the internet, and it's amazing resources out there, but the director will obviously tell you what he or she, the sort of visually what they had imagined. If they have a really strong opinion, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they want you to help them find the look. The DOP and the production designer, again, are all part of that sort of collaboration, and they have some strong ideas. And again, everyone's sort of leading each other and working together mostly to get the final product. A lot of directors reference other films, and they'll tell you to go and watch some films and look at the outfit that they wore, and they like to do a lot of referencing like that. Other directors do not at all want to do that. They want to make their own unique film without any sort of referencing, but it's by nature people will always kind of compare anyway, so it's sort of a bit of hard to avoid. Another good way of researching and using as images to help evoke the look for the film is looking at photographers and photography books. So you're not just looking at clothes, you're looking at sort of all over colour and visualisation. A lot of, in the past, like Nan Golden, Jeffrey Crewdson, Guy Strichet's, are 3 books that I've got that I often drag out and are very good for referencing, just in terms of colour and mood and all sorts of things. And with films that are based on real historical events, which both the films I'm going to talk about today are, then you obviously that's another whole kind of ball game, really. When I did Home Song Stories, Tony Ayres, who is the director, wrote it, and it's about him and his mother. So it's sort of like having like a little resourceful person right there, because you could just ask anything. But he had an amazing collection of photos. And Balibo was based on true events, and we tried really hard to dress the journalists exactly how they were dressed in real life, because originally we were going to use stock footage of their interviews and all the stuff that they did and sent back to Australia, and they were going to insert that into the film, but in the end we ended up shooting it all ourselves because we made them look so much like the real characters. Often I'll also go to a library, or in Sydney there's a Powerhouse Museum. I've got a great visual resource centre there. University libraries, wherever you can find your information, you just have to really just get out there and do it, basically. And the research will be done to provide a backup story or a history of a character that you can draw to create your look. So if for example, you've got a character that you sort of know on the page where he or she's from, what sort of income they've got, what sort of you're reading it, you're reading the character, you can see it on the page, but sometimes it's good to make up a bit of a backstory of where they've come from, why they are the way they are, and it sort of helps you to visualise what this person would wear. Great thing that we did on Home Song, and that a lot of people do, which is a great resource, is actual photo albums, your photo albums, your family photo albums, your friends, your mums, your grandmas, any sort of photo albums that might be of the era that you're making the film, are a fantastic resource. Magazines of the era are a great resource, but they are often more about fashion and not about real people doing real things. But again, good to get an idea if you're looking at, the way things were cut and what sort of, pants they were wearing back then, and just to get a little bit of an overview. But generally speaking, if you're making a film in Australia, period, and you're looking at a period film rather, and you're looking at fashion from the era in magazines, it's going to probably be more like high fashion that's come from London, which Australia at that time wasn't on par with. So you sort of have to go back a few years. The other thing to consider when you're doing your research is also you're looking into the colour palette and researching what sort of colour palette you want to do, and in concept of that. These days a lot of films are really pinging with the colour palettes, and they're with all the technology with the cameras these days, they can do so much with the grading and the tone, and the DOPs often have pretty, very intense ideas about how they want to shoot it, and so much so that, you might have we had a beautiful maroon Chong Sam on Home Song Stories, and we put it in front of camera for camera tests, and it turned kind of poo brown. And so you kind of there's a lot of that you've got to take into consideration when you sort of putting it all together. And often what they'll do is, if we're doing flashbacks in a film, they might sort of have a different colour palette for that. So you've got to be careful the colours that you choose for the clothes, because might do something crazy there, or maybe that's a good thing. So you consciously choose a colour that's going to really pop out with that treatment and the way that it's being shot. And the production design will also dictate a little bit too, because when they're dressing the set and building the sets and using all their colours, you can either make a conscious choice to be contrasting against that, or blending in, or it's all those decisions have to be made. And you don't want a situation where you might have the character wearing the same colour as the wall and blending in, and then unless it's a scripted thing. So, as part of the research and visualisation that you're doing in pre-production, there's so many different levels to consider. It's quite complicated. It can be quite complicated. And then, of course, I think Anna was going to talk about this, but then you add into budget restrictions, and that's a whole other, kettle of fish. And once you've got all your images and research and magazines and books, and it's good to start building, like, either depending on how you want to do it, folders with all the images in according to characters, how you see the characters, or you can do boards and put them up all over the office so everyone can see, and get bits of fabric swatches to put on the boards to help with the colour palette, and then you sort of basically start buying or making or borrowing and stealing the clothes to start building the costumes.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Cappi. And it's interesting to note that there are many ways in which a designer comes to their particular career. I was talking earlier to Cappi, and she actually served an extraordinary apprenticeship with the legendary Rose Chong costume house while studying, and slowly developed, I think, a lot of the skills while she was there. So it's there's not just one way that people become costume designers. So our next speaker, Edie Kurzer, initially came through the same route that I did through NIDA. And if I say of Edie's work that you can actually almost smell her costumes, that's not an insult. That's actually a great compliment, or it's meant to be. One of the work that she's going to concentrate on talking about building character is South Solitary, which is a film that when I looked at it the very first time, and I revisited it last week, and the minute I saw those wrinkled stockings and that slightly homemade knitwear, and once again, this is not an insult, it's a compliment, I knew I was in safe hands because there were real characters being developed. Edie has worked in theatre as well as in screen and film and television. She's had a relationship with Nadia Tass, who is a director who herself has worked through the different mediums, and she worked on Matching Jack, which some of you might have seen, In a Strange Land, so it can take you to Papua, places that are meant to be set in Papua New Guinea. I just found out recently that she went to New Orleans with Burt Reynolds, of all people, to do a film called Tempted, and the wonderful film Look Both Ways. So once again, a really diverse career. So I'll let her talk to you about building character.
Thanks, Fiona. That was a lovely introduction. There'll probably be a bit of crossover between Cappi's talk and Anna's talk and my talk, of course, since we're all costume designers. But I'm going to focus particularly on the characters in South Solitary, as Fiona mentioned. So, one costume supervisor and pattern maker, one standby, one costume/research assistant, one seamstress, one shoemaker, one milliner, one jeweller, 2 embroiderers, 1 dyer, 1 buttonholer, 5 costume hirers, 7 hand knitters, 1 knitting coach, and a chocolate supplier. These are the people who crossed my path in the course of getting the costumes ready to make the feature film South Solitary. It's a film with only 7 main characters, so in film terms that's quite a small number of people, and by the time we were filming there was only 3 of us working on the film. I can't help contemplate the distance between some of the scale of films we make here in Australia and the fantastic exhibition downstairs, if anybody has seen it. It ain't Hollywood here. I'm going to use my work on South Solitary, which was directed by Shirley Barrett, to highlight some of how the ideas and processes behind character development and how that translates into costume design. I guess one hopes that no one else spends as much time thinking through the logic of the costumes and just sees the film as a whole. But if it doesn't have meaning or logic to you, it can be quite difficult to make the decisions you need to make. And like Cappi, I prefer to work from photographs and real people reference rather than taking too much from magazines and the print media. Especially in this case, as we were dealing with characters who are of the sort of everyday, nothing special kind of people. If you can get your hands on real examples of clothes from the period, you can get a much better sense of the quality and behaviours of the fabrics and the colours of the time. So I tried to do this. Generally, most of the clothes are too old to actually be used in the film, but they're perfect for research purposes. We were very fortunate that just before pre-production began, Peter Doyle put out an amazing book called Crooks Like Us. It's a collection of what the Sydney Police Department called special photographs, and they were taken between 1910 and 1930. They were informal mugshots of certain people taken when, quote, in the opinion of the arresting officer, the offender is liable to lapse into a life of vice and crime, unquote. Typically there are 2 shots, one standing and one sitting, or hat on, hat off, or one close-up and one wider picture. There are even some of detectives in various poses and some group shots of the criminals. And quite a lot of women, which is really unusual as well to be able to find. Their images made all the more enticing because there's so little information that exists about any of these people. Many more photos and the information about them was destroyed in the 1980s by a flood in the basement where they'd been kept. So there's not that many of them out of all the ones that were there. I pored through this book often to remind me of the feel of the times. Even though our film's situation was different to the circumstances of most of these characters, I felt that there was an atmosphere about them that was very helpful for my design work. The director loved these crooks like us images, and they were a great conversation starter. I should mention too that that the costume doesn't finish at the neck, so there's a lot of discussion that also goes on with the hair and makeup department, and you try and work very closely with those people to get the look of the total character that everybody's after, and to keep the actors happy. So the director wanted a scrubbed up feel for the Stanley family, and Barry Otto's character, nothing too broken down or dirty. I was keen on a more grubby overall feel for the people on the island, but we pulled it back a lot. Alma Stanley, so this is the character played by Essie Davis, was house proud and looked after her family as best she could. This meant I needed to come up with other ways of showing the ageing of the costumes, so it tended to be more in the way that they were worn than that she wasn't able to keep them clean. Yeah, we imagine the kids growing out of their clothes and having to make do until something larger could be sewn or knitted for them. Nettie's dresses had extra fabric sewn on the bottom of them to make them longer. Seams were let out. There was a lot of darning, patching and repairing work that went into almost all of the clothes. We also thought about the amount of clothes that could physically be transported to the island, the practicalities of keeping warm in such a desolate and exposed place, and the expectations of the times and how one was supposed to be dressed, even in these remote circumstances. Martin Sokus's character was called Fleet. He was Welsh, an ex-sailor who'd been living on the island, shell-shocked and troubled, for about 8 years. We logically decided his clothing would be particularly limited in both quantity and colour. He had cared for the few articles he had, patching and mending. He was a good sewer. He did embroidery work to occupy himself on the long nights in the lighthouse. So for my research for that character, I spent time down at the fantastic Seamen's Mission buildings down near the Docklands, who had an exhibition about sailors at the time, and used some photos from there as reference, as well as from some other sources. Ultimately, we had a traditional Cornish fisherman's garnsey knitted for him and shipped over. And if you don't know what a garnsey is, and I didn't when we started looking into this, they're a jumper totally knitted in one piece. No seams anywhere, and made from a specific type of twisted wool that repels water and wind. So sailors used to like them, and they often had a specific design to the town or the area that the sailor came from. So we sent away for one of those, and eventually it arrived. But back to Meredith and the complex woman she was. She had been a young typist in the city when she had unfortunately fallen pregnant and needed an abortion which had led to medical problems. Only her strict uncle had offered to help her out of her predicament, and she in turn was now helping him. She was still hopeful that she would find love and be loved. A relatively futile idea on an island of 7 people, as Alma pointed out, but you never know. So her costumes needed to reflect some of these things. Once she'd received a wage and could buy herself clothes, but more recently she would have to have relied on the generosity of her uncle. Many women would remodel and reuse their clothes as the times and fashions changed. Hemlines came up and down, or layers were added or removed. There was a need for inventiveness. Meredith wasn't a style queen, she made do, and sometimes her combinations worked more successfully than in other times. Now, Lucille the sheep. Well, there are actually 2 lambs and 2 sheep, but she needed a number of variations on her lovely pink bonnet and matinee jacket as she grew bigger and got a lot grubbier. I think we ended up with about 4 of each as the film went on. Hurry up. Okay. Oh, now she says I have to stop. So there we go. Come back later for more. You want to do the rest?
Mention that we sometimes actually work for non-humans or different species. Our next speaker, Anna Borghesi, before this talk, I was looking at some of the old films, the work of the panel, and I looked at Romper Stomper, which I'd sort of forgotten what an important film it was, and to look at the impossibly beautiful, impossibly young lead Russell Crowe of this film. And what was interesting too is that incredibly threatening Russell Crowe, and we've probably all heard stories anyway, but the person who was responsible in this particular film for creating such an extraordinary, original, edgy look was Anna Borghesi, and it really reminded me of what an extraordinary look it was. But to go to an absolutely opposite, dare I use the word, iconic Australian man, she's also designed Ned Kelly, not the Mick Jagger one, I don't think you were quite around in those days, but the more recent Ned Kelly, and a complete contrast, Mao's Last Dancer, where you move from China many decades ago to Houston Ballet to Australia and around the world, and this shows the diversity of Anna's work. And she also actually came from a theatrical background, but went straight into designing costume. And she's going to talk about working particularly with the relationship with the director, the process of working with people like production designers, that collaboration that is in the title, and also that final collaboration, the dreaded budget.
Thanks, Bridie. Okay, so that's 30 seconds getting over here. Rightio, I'm old school. I've got drawings. So I'll hand them around at your leisure. You can look at them, pass them to the next person, all that gear. I'm going to talk fast. If anybody goes, what? Slow down, put your hand up. Anna Borghesi, costume designer. It's like going to an AA meeting and confessing. So I graduated from NIDA too long ago to remember the date. Decided that could not think of anything worse than working in theatre or film or anything to do with design after graduating. So I went and worked in Kalgoorlie in the mining industry for a year and went, actually, unpack that, go back. So ended up coming back to Victoria and got a gig on Moonlight Stampede with Harriet Taylor when Next Wave Festival was just getting up and about. And that was a baptism of fire. No money, a lot of young, enthusiastic performers, lots of costumes, me completely broken and exhausted by the end of it, but then going a week later, actually that wasn't too bad. I could do that again. And here I am, years later, you know, having just reconciled myself to the fact that I'm ready for retirement. But there's been a lot that's happened in between. I concentrated on theatre originally after I graduated, and then I worked with a European German director called Mark Adam on a production at Anthill, where I filled Anthill Theatre in Napier Street in South Melbourne with dirt and rubble and built a seating arrangement out of boral scaffolding, much to the production manager's total horror, and before there were any OH&S regulations. And I went down, and they kept on saying to me, we can't afford it, you can't do that, we can't afford it. I was going, no, see, wrong, no. So I went down to Boral. I stood in the office at Boral. I said, okay, here's the thing. You can have my first-born child, thinking that's not going to happen for ages. Okay, I'll come and work in the office for you. I badgered them. They gave us the seating. And it was out of sheer... I was so naive. I thought, you know what? That we need it. So why shouldn't somebody give it to me? And I think I've survived and persevered and operated pretty much on that basis from then, and it's got me where it got me. Some say that's a good thing, some say that's a bad thing. Did that. So from working with Mark, he said, listen, why don't you come to Europe and do some work with me? I went, oh yeah, because that's what you do. You just go to Europe and do some work with a director who lives in Europe. So I approached the Australia Council for some money, and they gave it to me. So I went there and I worked with him for a while, and I observed with Pina Bausch while I was there, which was a game changer for me because she was a remarkable, remarkable woman. Remarkable in terms of her output, remarkable in terms of her view of the world, just remarkable. And terrifying. She said, she never spoke to me. She said, what did she call me? I think she called me number once, and I went, okay. But it was inspiring to be there and watch that. as a result of that, this is just a mini background to get you to get to Romper Stomper. I came back, and I came back from Europe full of vim and vigour and thinking, oh, that's great, I can take on the world. And somebody said to me, there's a local film that's being made, and it's about skinheads. You've just been in Germany. I went, right, yeah, because they're everywhere. And I thought, oh, well, never done a film, may as well give it a red hot go. So submitted my CV, which was pretty undoctored, except I did have in there my trip to Germany. And it was put in with 101 other CVs from costume designers who thought that would be a good gig to get. But luckily for me, the associate producer on the gig was German and a fan of Peanut Bausch. And he said to the producer, listen, we should get this girl in and have a chat to her. I turned up to the interview, again, and I have NIDA to blame for this. And they looked at my CV and they said, but you've never done a film. I went, well, so? I said, I'm a designer, I'm a costume designer. Costume design is costume design. And they said, but you've never even been a standby. And I went, I'm thinking, thought bubble, what is a standby? I said, well, I didn't train to be a standby, I trained to be a costume designer. So I'm applying for the job of costume designer, not standby. Thinking, I've got to find out what a standby is, because obviously it's quite important. And for those of you who don't know what a standby is a key component in the costume department on any film, because they do all the stuff that you can't do because you're in the office trying to get a whole lot of other stuff done, getting a whole lot of actors fitting, and they're on set and they're your eyes. So they watch every take, everything that happens, they document it. They're responsible for the continuity of the costume department. However, I didn't want that job because I would be really bad at that job. Because I go, do you take the Polaroid before or after they turn over? Bad, not good. So Jeffrey Wright, I then met with Jeffrey Wright, who was the director, and he said, well, you've never done a film. I went, oh, that old chestnut. I said, yeah, okay. He said, I'm going to give you a test. So he gave me a test. He gave me some films to watch, like Cappi was saying. Directors love giving you other people's work to watch and going, oh, did you see that? Did you see that bit? Oh, did you see that? It's like, yeah, I'm right. I'm here. I'm watching. I get it. But can't we come up with something new? No, but did you see that bit? Yeah, sorry. So I passed the test, and that was my first foray into film, which was Romper Stomper. Met Stephen Jones Evans, who's a production designer, and Stephen and Jeffrey and I then went on to collaborate on quite a few films. I've worked very closely with Stephen over the years. He's a brilliant production designer. We speak a very similar visual language, so it's really quick for us to get to the end of problems. We get to A to Z pretty quickly. We can miss a whole lot of stuff in the middle, and we get there and we come up with pretty solid solutions. On Romper Stomper, again, funny first story, got to tell it. Was in the production office going, right, okay, really clearly have no idea what I'm doing, but it's okay, I'm a costume designer, it'll be fine. The first AD, again, for people who aren't familiar with this weird Cleon film speak, he's responsible for all the activity on set, doing the micromanaging for the director, basically. The director just wants to communicate with the actors. The first AD, first assistant director, manages the entire shoot of the set. So the first AD is sitting at a desk, and this was pre-computer. Whew. So he had a thing out called a strip board. I didn't know it was called that at the time, which is when you get all your shooting days and you put down the numbers of all the scenes you want to shoot on that day, and you put them on these crazy bits of coloured paper, and then you start putting them in these crazy folders so you can make a schedule. Me, never seen one. Went up to him and said, oh, that looks pretty interesting. What are you doing? He went, what do you mean, what am I doing? I said, well, what is that? He said, what do you mean, what is that? He said, it's a strip board. I went, thinking, no, I need more information. He said, it's the schedule. I went, oh, okay, got it. He said, have you ever done a film before? I went, no. He went, oh my God. He said, you do know about doubles, don't you? I went, oh, yeah, everybody knows about doubles. Don't know about doubles. So went up to Stephen Jones Evans and said, what does he mean doubles? He said, 2 at least of everything. Fight scenes, don't shoot them in sequence. Jacket gets trashed if you don't have another one. I went, oh, doubles, got it. In fact, triples, quadruples. I've worked on projects where we've had 30 pairs of exactly the same pair of pants because they're all distressed and broken down to various stages. But baptism of fire, thinking, I'm a costume designer, I've trained, I know what I'm doing, I can do this. And we did, we went ahead and did it. It was a difficult job. It was long, it was hard. Costume design is like that. Sometimes you just think, is it worth going home? Is it really worth going home tonight and putting my head on the pillow for 2 hours just so I can get up and come back in here and keep going? But you do, and it's about a commitment to the visual language of the film. You know, you work with a director really closely, you work with your production designer really closely to come up with this, with the unconscious, the visual story that just taps into an audience without waving the flag, without being over the top, without that, which is my style, not being that, but just giving the audience what they need to help them sustain their disbelief, to help them believe and commit to that character. Russell Crowe was really an interesting actor to work with. Russell is a big personality, he was then. Russell was very, not so much particular about what he wanted to wear, but very particular about what he wouldn't wear. Me, I wanted him to wear a Conti. Russell was never going to wear the Conti. And I said, but you're in Melbourne and you're a skinhead. He's going, Contis are for puffs. I went, okay, fine. Let's just not continue this argument. At one point, Russell was having his tattoos done and he was lying on the floor, just in his undies, getting all his tats done. And I went up to him really closely because we'd had quite a lot of dialogue and a little bit of it got quite heated. And I said to him, okay, Russ, here's the thing. You're in your undies and I'm dressed. I'm the costume designer, you're the actor. And it was really a moment for us where we connected and he went, okay. And then after that, it was pretty much fine. But the thing is with actors, as a costume designer, a lot of the work you do with actors can be seen, I think, 10% design, 90% babysitting. They're incredibly fragile people who I couldn't do it. I could no more stand, I mean, I'm doing it now, but this isn't real. I could no more stand in front of an audience or in front of a camera, pretend, act, and then do it again and again and again. It horrifies me, the thought. I have a lot of respect for actors, good actors, and I think making that commitment is a really big thing, and you need to be there as a costume designer to support them. You need to collaborate with them. As I evolved as a costume designer and became more confident about my work, I would say to an actor, maybe somebody who'd had a bad costume experience, I'd say, okay, here's the thing. This is the bottom line. You look good, I look good. You look bad, I never work again. So think about it. Really? What am I going to do? I'm really going to try and make you look good. And when I say look good, I mean right in terms of character, right for the film, right for what you're trying to communicate, right for where you came from. The thing is, as costume designers, we end up with heads full of the most insane, irrelevant, not important to anybody else in the whole world information. And you're walking around with all this stuff in your head all the time. If I'm in the middle of a project, everywhere I go, everything I look at is somehow being reprocessed and recalibrated into ideas that may then emerge in a project. And it doesn't matter if it's a period film, because if you're doing a period film like Ned Kelly, the reality of that is you're a contemporary audience. If I put current day actors who have real 2000s, bodies into real period frock coats, they're all going to be walking around like this because the armholes are cut so high and they're all so small, and we just don't have bodies like that anymore. So we have to reinvent after having absorbed all the information, like what Cappi was talking about. You suck all that in, it gets regurgitated, and it's reproduced as a visual image, as a visual that will connect with a contemporary audience. It's an interesting, exhaustive process, but it's what we need to do to sell period. It's like, it was really great when Edie showed you the book about the Sydney Crooks, because if you think about the show that's on, I think it's on at the moment, Squizzy Taylor, that's not that book, but that book is that period. So it's an informed decision that the producers have made to actually enhance the look of that period to make the topic more palatable. Right, I need to wind up. Just pass the drawings around. Again, like with Edie and Cappi, there's a whole, really hours of stuff to say. Pass the drawings around, and when you finish with them, just dump them somewhere. I'll find them. But yeah, you can ask questions.
will be frisking at the door, so those portfolios will come back because they're exquisite drawings. So what we have now, we have 10 minutes for questions, which you can either ask specifically from a particular member of the panel, or if you have a general question, we can see who'd most like to answer it. So has anyone got any questions to start off with? Gentleman here.
If you're designing futuristic things, you obviously got no reference except your imagination. How does that work?
Who'd like to answer that? Cappi, you've just worked back and forward.
Look, it's a bit daunting depending on the script and the film, I suppose, and what the image the directors, the writers, the producers have already got for the futuristic world. But it can also be, I just did a film that was set 20 years in the future, but it was set in a decade now, like it was now just, and everything had stopped. So we kind of used fashion from today and sort of disintegrated it. But we also could do we had some soldiers, and we were able to do lots of fun things with that. So it can be quite a challenge, but quite a good challenge, because there's no rules. You know, there's nothing to reference. No one can say, well, they wouldn't have worn that because no one's been there. So yeah, it can be quite an amazing. It's a completely different sort of form of research and concept in that regard.
I worked on a film called Pitch Black. Again, I don't know if anybody's seen it. Who goes to the movies? And that was very futuristic. I mean, I don't know, futuristic. It was set later, not now. And the constraints that we found were access to materials and fabrics that allowed you to not laugh at it and go, yes, if we're going to be wearing that. Yeah, like Doctor Who. That the actors could still work in. But so this was in Queensland. I got an old truck tarp off from one of the studios and had it treated and chopped that up and made that into pants for somebody, and did a lot of that kind of stuff. So, but it's surprising how conservative producers and some actors are about how far you can go. Even if you say, listen, it's science fiction. And if their pants don't have a zip, they still go, but it's got no zip. It's like, oh, my God. You know what? It's not now. It's then. It's, 500 years in the future. But, so they're still trying to rationalise the garment according to how we think now. And that's what needs to not. You can't do that. You just have to go, you know what? Just imagine that we've got something, just imagine that it can be something else. But it is often determined by the conservatism of the production, how far you can go with that kind of stuff, how far into the future you can look.
Yeah. There was a question up the back, yes?
Anna, I didn't get the word you used that Russell wouldn't wear.
Oh, a Conti. Sorry, I've got microphone fatigue. Woo. In Melbourne, in the Skins and Sharps, there was a particular cardigan that was really revered. It was called a Conti, and it was made by the Conti family in their very special knitwear fabric in Northcote. And the Skins would actually go in and have them custom made. So you would go in and see Mr. Conti and his good wife, or you'd go to Goodman's, which wasn't quite as good, except they did the tab on the back. And you'd choose your colours and your design and how long your collar was or how short it was. And a lot of the guys who embraced the culture were very skinny. So they'd have their Harry High Pants Staggers jeans on with the really wide bell bottoms and their chisel toe shoes and their really tight cornies, their Conti cardigans. And that was part of the look of, for Melbourne. It spread into Sydney a little bit, but it was much more a Melbourne phenomena. And Russell's argument to me was, well, it's not then, it's now. This is 1990 whatever, not 1970. But I thought it was a good reference. But, we agreed to disagree, and he didn't wear it.
Thanks. Any other questions? Yes?
What is the total out of the film budget that's actually devoted to the costume budget?
Not enough. Never enough. It's supposed to be 1%, and it never is. They start off by offering you half of 1%, and then you spend a lot of time arguing with them, going, it's not, doing breakdowns, saying I'm wasting my time doing budgets when I should be making costumes. But it's supposed to be around that figure. But it can go up to, on Ned Kelly, we had about 4% of the total budget because we had to manufacture thousands of costumes. We made about 2,000 garments on that film.
Yes, and
Well,
of
I
course,
didn't.
labour is always the most expensive component rather than the actual fabrics themselves, and the budget takes that into account as well.
Okay, this question is for Annabelle. There was a wide range of costumes in Miles' Last Dance. Were you responsible for every one of them?
Yes. I was a little bit broken after that. Going backwards and forwards from Sydney to China was one of the hardest things I've ever done on a job, because I'd have 5 days in Sydney, 5 days in Beijing, and going back to Beijing, it was Groundhog Day. I'd get back there and go, okay. So the first time I'd sent them over all the drawings and they'd done a lot of pre-production for it, and I got there and I went, oh, where are all the costumes? They were tied up in canvas bags. I said, oh, why aren't they hanging up? Oh, because they're easier to move around. I said, yeah, but we're in the production office. Everything was folded up and stored in these big canvas bags. And I said, well, hey, how about we get some coat hangers? You know, like, surely we can, you know, it's China. And they went, I said, you know, those great plastic coated ones. Oh, no, we can't get those. They're just for import only. How about some racks? The costume racks were plumbing pipe cobbled together with gaffer tape. And, no, it was ridiculous. And I'd go, and then when I'd get back, all the costumes would be back in the bags. I'd say, okay, let's get the costumes out of the bags again so I can see them. So it was, every costume I was involved with. Some of the costumes that came, we got some costumes from the Australian Ballet for the Australian Ballet productions that we used. But at the end of the day, anything, as costume designers, anything that somebody has on their back, we have scanned and ticked, unless we're sick, and they sneak something on set on the day we're not there. But that's why you don't get sick and you don't not be there. It should never be arbitrary. Everything is an informed decision based on what you're trying to communicate.
Hi. As much as you're always chasing that elusive 1% of the budget, is time more precious than money?
Yeah, there's never enough time either. And that, you could have a huge pre-production, and think, oh, great, this is going to be wonderful. But then all sorts of things happen with cast availability. The casting's a big thing that always stitches us up, because they wait till the last minute to cast them, or they've got restrictions, they can't get them to Melbourne or to wherever you're shooting.
Some other shoot.
Yeah.
Filming something else before
And
coming over to yours.
so you always end up cramming about 4 weeks' work into 1 week, which is always the last week of pre-production. And I don't know any job that it's been any different.
And then sometimes they sneak in the idea, oh, we're just going to do a little photo shoot before we start filming, or we just have to film this little section because this person's not available, or we can only get this location. And you're tied into that, which eats into all your pre-production time, and that often causes all sorts of problems.
Yes, who's next?
Just me. This is directed to all of you, or anyone who wishes to answer. And you did say at the start the difference between fashion and creating a character. And I was just wondering, as a student of fashion design who's very interested in costume, what recommendations do you have in terms of entry pathways or getting yourself into the industry, or how do you self-educate yourself to get into to work as a costume designer? And I just wanted to say also, when you do study fashion, I think many people don't realise that the course is about creating clothes rather than the following of fashion. So I don't know, so do you have any advice or,
Work experience? It's
Yeah,
always good just to see. Hands-on experience, if possible, would be. No. In fact, if you are a student from an institution, it's easier for you to come on as a work experience person, because you'll be covered and exploited, but you'll be covered by insurance through the university. Coming on as because nowadays with all OH&S, it's a lot harder for people just to come and work for free on films. You have to be insured, and they have to. It's a producer's nightmare. They don't like it really, but there's definitely through through courses, there's an avenue there. But also, I think there's a lot of Film Victoria do a lot of attachment positions. I've had couple of attachments work with me. They are employed by Film Vic and a certain component from the production company, and that's a really good way to do it. And that's not just in costume, but in any of the departments.
And one of the things
Film
that,
Victoria.
that you said is the first thing to acknowledge, that costume design is not fashion design. I get a great many phone calls every week from people saying, I'm a fashion designer, I find it's not creative enough, I want to do costume design, can you get me some jobs? And that's always an interesting conversation. I often say things that they don't want to hear, but it really is very, very different. And another of the things surprises me is that a lot of people don't actually go and see films and see theatre. So actually watching and looking at the work of others is a very important part as well.
And I think one of the best things you can do is just to get jobs on small films. You know, there's lots of student films and film schools, and now with the web and people making all sorts of things for that, I think just getting that experience, unlike Anna bowling up, to a feature film and landing a job, is the best way, because you learn what other people's roles are. I mean, you don't work in isolation as a costume designer, you're part of a whole team making a film. So it's really important to know what other departments do and what a camera does and what the possibilities are. So if you start on student films with other people that are at the same level as you, they're much more willing to explain things to you. And also that gives you something to show other people that you've actually done, which is then a stepping stone to go somewhere else.
And you progress with your peers.
Yeah.
Have we got time for one more question?
Any questions over this side?
Last question.
Turn around.
Hi there.
Hi.
This is just a general question to anyone that would like to answer it. I was actually just wondering how important you think it is for a costume designer to have experience in actually making clothes or costumes themselves, being hands-on in that respect, or just to have a general knowledge of how garments come together.
I think it's really important that you know how something goes together. If, just referencing again all those drawings are done knowing, I know how to make a garment. I know how it goes together. It means that I can have a dialogue with a maker, a costumier, and say, okay, I think the dart needs to go there. I'd like it to be fitted through under the bust so we could use this seam or that seam. You don't have to do it. I wouldn't no more sit at a sewing machine than stick up pins in my eyes. And the last time my mother asked me to take up her pants, I made them so short. She's never asked me again. But I did. She said, is that where we pin them? I went, yeah. But for me, personally, I want to be able to have the dialogue with the people that I'm working with, again, out of respect for what they do, saying, and again, so then if you do draw something that's futuristic and completely nuts, you can say, okay, how can we do this? So you can't be bamboozled by them either saying, oh, no, you can't do that. That's impossible. Isn't that impossible? Rubbish. Let's just work it out, okay? If we do this with the pattern, if we do that, so that's my thing on that.
Any last other contribution with that, or you agree with what Anna's saying?
Pretty much.
Yes. Okay, well, look, thank you very much, Anna Borghesi, Edie Kurzer and Cappi Ireland.